Welcome in this new podcast episode. Today I'm talking to Erin Remblance. Welcome, Erin.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
I've came across your posts on LinkedIn because you were writing a lot about degrowth. And I think that I saw some posts where you referenced a couple of people that I follow in this area. That's why your post popped up. And I thought, and the more I saw your post, the more I thought I want to really talk to her about what she's doing, what she's going on. And I think an interesting part to talk about is your work in Rebiz. We get to that in a bit, but
Yeah, yeah.
let's start where you come from, because you come from a market where it is all about growth. It's all about more selling more products. It's all about you know beauty and all this stuff, right? So. Um, what happened? Why did, and you can tell where you came from, but what happened and why did you make the change?
Yeah, so I assume you mean L'Oreal. I was working at L'Oreal.
Yeah, and Unilever.
Yeah, yeah. So my first job out of university. So I did a Bachelor of Business Administration with honors. And then my first job out of university was with Nestle. So just a little graduate there. And it suited me, like it just made sense. I was very analytical, but I was also very good at building relationships with buyers. And I ended up being an account manager at Nestle for a few years. And then very ambitious, very young, wanted to get ahead, and Nestle was slowing me down. So I moved on to Unilever and I stepped up to being a national account manager there. And I was managing one of their biggest portfolios with their biggest account for several years, and always ambitious, wanted to do more. So, and I wanted to travel. So I moved to London and I was working for L'Oreal there, and I was managing their biggest client, Boots, with their most profitable segment, which was fragrances. And I did that for a few years. And it was fine and it was fun and I enjoyed it. And underlying, I sort of was wondering, is this the best way for me to be spending my time? Like ultimately, as fun as it is and as nice as it is and as lovely as the products are, it's a little bit of sense of just making the L'Oreal group richer. Like ultimately, this is what my work amounts to. But that is probably not truly why I left. I had my daughter and I wanted to move back to Sydney and also didn't necessarily want to work full time. And so after having my son, actually after having my daughter, went back into part-time work in the same industry, had my son, moved across to energy efficiency because I was starting to understand that actually there's a lot more going on here than I was really aware of. And eventually moved into carbon reduction, which it was called the Carbon Reduction Institute, but it was really about selling offsets. And the more I was reading, and I was very immersed in all the research and very connected to other concerned people through some groups that I joined, it was just very apparent that that's just not enough anymore. It might have been enough a few decades ago, but we're well past that. And so I've sort of got this sense of turning up to work not ticking enough boxes, like not making enough difference, not being exactly what I wanted to be doing. So I chose to leave there, and I devoted a good chunk of time just to learning. So I wanted to know if carbon offsets aren't the solution, what is? And that's where I started studying more about degrowth. And I am actually part of a economics course at a university at the moment, and working with some degrowth scholars. But even the degrowth scholar I'm working with would admit that a lot of people are self-taught at this stage on degrowth, because it's not like taking mainstream economics courses. You sort of have to do the work yourself. And then we've formed Rebiz at the start of this year, I was finding that a lot of sustainability roles were about trying to sustain business as usual. And as I said, with my carbon reduction role, like that's not where my heart is. I'm really very conscious of what we need to be doing. And I wanted to create a sustainability course that was very honest about the changes we need individually, organizationally, and systemically. And that to me is what Rebiz is about. So that's how I got here. That was a long journey.
Well, you mentioned that you got into carbon offset, and slowly you started reading more about, if this is enough, yes or no. Was there something that really triggered it, or was it just reading more about and slowly becoming more aware of what really goes on?
Yeah, I think anyone who's really become conscious of what we're going through has a few like, I get it moments. There might be a few expletives in there for some people. And I've got a few of those moments, but the very reason why I left the Carbon Reduction Institute was I was reading a book. It's by an Australian senator who was part of the Greens Party, and he was talking about the exponential growth function, which everyone understands. And I knew in relation to compound interest, and like the exponential growth you get by investing early and young is fantastic, unless it's correlated highly with ecological footprint. And then actually it's quite destructive. And I was learning about, 3% growth over 1 year seems small, but over 24 years, it's a doubling. And over 100-year time, that's 19 times larger. And that's what we're doing with our GDP. It's highly correlated with material footprints. We're growing it at 3% a year. In 100 years' time, our ecological footprint will be 19 times larger, and that's not sustainable. So there's something fundamentally wrong with the system that most of the world is trying to actively pursue and grow. So I was sort of reading that and then going to work and just seeing how what we were doing just was allowing that to continue, just by allowing companies to keep getting bigger and bigger and just offset their footprint. Yeah.
And I don't know how to imagine this, because if you look at what we consume today, it, I who live in the Western world, but people around me, and the resources that we use is in what we extract from the earth, mostly on the not so wealthy parts of the world,
Yeah.
and or could just say poor parts. Um,
Yeah.
Also extracting from the poor people, but also in general, just using people as resources. Um, it's I think it's really difficult for me to imagine how we could even go like 19 times more.
Yeah, I know. Like, and it's alarming, right? So there's two key metrics that I always think of when I think about we're already too big. And one is that Earth Overshoot Day falls on the 2nd of August this year. And so for the remainder of the year, we'll be stealing from future generations or from countries that aren't consuming as much. Well, actually, that's not true. We're just stealing from future generations because that's a global level. And so that means we need 1.7 planet Earths to sustain our current lifestyles. Like, so we're already breaching, what the Earth can regenerate in 1 year. But that 1.7 planet Earths, that's an average. And there's some countries that live as if we have 6 planet Earths. There's a few more that live as if we have 5 planet Earths. Here in Australia, we live as if we have 4 planet Earths. There's a few more countries that live as if we have 3. Like, there's all of these over-consuming countries that get us to where we are. And, there's something like quite a large number, I'll take a guess, 60 countries that are under-consuming, and they don't have an Earth Overshoot Day. So they're balancing out the over-consuming countries. The other thing I think of when I think about how we're already too big is that we're breaching 6 of 9 planetary boundaries. There's 3 that we haven't yet breached. One is ocean acidification. That's under peer review for being breached. Another is aerosols, which is unquantified yet. And the third is the ozone layer, which, thank you to the Montreal Protocol, we're not breaching. But if climate change goes too far, it burns through the ozone layer and we are again. So, like there's no good, healthy metric that says we can continue to grow our economies further. We're already too big.
And when you look at that picture, do you feel like hope or do you feel like despair?
I mean, it's not a hopeful message. I fully get what you're trying to say. I personally try to live hope free, not about whether I have hope or whether I feel despair. And the reason I feel that way is because there's a great quote, I'm probably misquote it, by Wendell Berry, and it just says, like, we just need to do what the world requires of us. We don't have the right to ask whether we're going to succeed or not. We just have to do what the world needs if we want to continue to live on it. And I just try and move forward with that in my head. And I don't want whether I do something today to be dependent on whether I feel hopeful, or if I choose not to act, it's because I'm feeling hopeless. Like, I just want to keep moving forward and doing what I'm capable of doing. So I don't like to act on the basis of hope. But I do think there's a conversation there around grief. And there's 5 stages of grief. They are denial. I think we've all heard of climate deniers. There's bargaining, and I think we're in a little bit of the stage of bargaining at the moment where we think technology might save us and we don't really have to change how we're living. Depression, anger, and acceptance. And I think as soon as you can move through to that acceptance stage, then you can really turn your grief into something really powerful. And if I'm ever feeling sort of upset or sad or despairing, then I will try and use that grief and turn it into an action that I can take today. And that does tend to make the grief go away a little bit.
Yeah, I've heard that more often, that when you take action, it really makes you feel different because you feel like you're doing something, right?
Yeah, for sure. Like, I could probably give you a dozen times where I've been up in the nighttime, and I've got small kids, so I'm often up in the nighttime anyway. But I'd be like, oh, like just thinking ahead, or just knowing some new piece of information, or thinking about the sea level rise, or whatever, like all of the bad news, and going, okay, well, I just need to do something. And I literally will write to 6 MPs that I just know off by heart who might be conducive to my message, or put a post on Facebook, or just post somewhere, because that is something that I can do. And if it reaches one person, and that's one person that I didn't reach without having done that. So just I think if you feel like you're doing as much as you're capable of, it does make the situation less upsetting. I think it helps, is my experience. That's actually
Also,
why I started writing. Sorry. I was reading, so I read the book I told you about by the Australian Green senator, and then I read a few more books on degrowth, and I was like, right, well, more people need to know about this. This is very important. I don't have any writing qualifications. I didn't know anyone in the newspaper industry or the online publication industry, but I just put together a 1,000-word article on the topic of degrowth and why it was important for people to know about it, and sent it to a few different places, hoping someone would take it. And it did get published, very small publications in Australia. They did publish it. And I lined it up with Earth Overshoot Day in 2021. But then it got picked up on LinkedIn by Aluminum. And that's been a really rewarding partnership with them since they published it. And it got a bit more traction from there. So yeah, that was how my activism and my writing was born.
and do you get paid by Lumen on your columns?
No, no, I just do that as part of my hope to reach more people.
Do you, because I always talk to a friend once in a while about this topic, and about writing and having these really reading about the stuff and then thinking about it and sharing it. And at the other end, you have the activist, people who just go sit on the street and blockade the road or whatever. And he says, and I'm not sure, but he says, I think we can talk forever or write articles forever, but the people will really make a difference, because are these people, because if their numbers grow, um, government will see that they have to take action. They have to do something to, you know, support the people who support them, right? Something like that.
Yeah,
Citizens.
yeah.
How do you feel about that? How do you feel that your importance of the writing compared to really activism, like demonstrating?
Oh, look, I wish I could demonstrate like those people. I think it's hugely important work, and I think they're brave, and I hope one day I do it. Like I've been to Extinction Rebellion events and I've done the training. I'm just not in a position to get arrested because of my children. I just don't want to risk a jail sentence. So if anyone who is prepared to do that, I applaud them, and I think they're amazing, and it's very important work. And yeah, I would agree. I think they're changing the conversation on this subject in a very important way. Um, I think it's also important to change hearts and minds as well. So in other ways, and the more you can do that, the more you might engage people who might also then become activists, or even just vote differently. Like there is no climate friend. Well, really, there is some, but then in smaller nations, climate friendly governments in power doing what we need to do to reach the Paris Agreement yet. And so, in democracies, that means we're not voting them in. So there's still a lot of work to be done with the general public to get to where we need to be. So yeah, I don't think that writing is the be all and end all. I still think it can help influence people.
Yeah, a couple of those countries are Costa Rica, Ghana, and Bhutan, for example.
And Bolivia, I think Bolivia,
Oh,
Uruguay, some of those places are
right,
probably,
right.
more conscious of what we need to do and less antagonistic of the environment
Hmm.
than some of the more Western wealthy nations, over-consuming nations.
Yeah, and I think about, for example, the work by Kate Raworth, where she talks about the on the outer ring and the inner ring, right? So that these countries don't overshoot the outer ring or
Yeah.
just very little, and but also they are still short on the inner circle, right? So the people sometimes don't have enough, or the bottom line is still low at these countries, but they're improving, so that's good. Also, Ghana and Costa Rica both use the inner development goals as a tool for the government to work with for their citizens. And I think that's also very beautiful. So the SDGs they support, but they also support the inner development and use it in their governments in decision making and in policies and so on. So you wrote an article, a post on how you think that the large corporations will never do enough to change. And you say we need to focus on governments to make a change. And you just mentioned we should vote differently, for example. But what do you think are ideas to speed this up, to really make progress and to make governments do things? Because right now, these large corporations are really influencing government and they are making decisions that support their work. And, tell us that we are not important enough as citizens, for example.
Yeah, like I don't know how to make it happen quickly and with the speed that we need, but my theory of change is basically predicated on social tipping points. So I think a lot of people are aware of climate tipping points, and I often describe it as a race between social tipping points and climate tipping points. So there's so many examples of where it's happened in the past. The move from smoking being something that was seen as socially desirable to something that was pretty uncool and actually a bit gross sort of turned very quickly. And it's only a few decades ago that you could go on a long haul flight and someone would be smoking next to you the whole time, or you'd be eating at a restaurant or in your office block and someone would be smoking away. So that turned very quickly. The public opinion on that changed. The way that the world has moved away from homophobia and embraced homosexuality, because it's the right thing to do. But, that was a social tipping point. That was people being active and talking about it openly. And same with probably women's rights and civil rights. They're all the same sort of things. And the brave activists we're just talking about, all played a big role in changing public opinion on that. So I don't know how we do it quickly necessarily, but I think governments will start to act a bit more and in the right direction when we can start to change public opinion in a big way. And the science says that if you can get 25% of people on board with a cause, it very quickly becomes 75% of people. So we're just going to keep pushing and keep using our voices to try and reach that tipping point.
What are some of the small actions that you advise people to do, for example, then?
So I'm sort of wherever I have the opportunity, encouraging people not to see themselves as a consumer. So how you do or don't spend your money, like I don't think that's where your action, your greatest abilities to influence lie. And also not to see yourself as an employee necessarily. So how you do or don't earn your money. We're all trapped in the same system. Some of us will need to earn money. Some of us will do things that we know are harmful because we need to eat. There's not enough jobs necessarily in the harm or the not harm causing sectors for people. That's the system, right? So if you are in that situation, I don't think it means you can't do anything. But I would say that we can all be citizens and we can use our voices and try and influence in other ways. So, are you talking to people about this? Are you, holding town hall events? Are you helping a climate friendly politician, not even just climate, it's all of our ecological crises to get elected? Are you trying to move public perception on various things? Like, I just think we can be so much more than just consumers or employees. And we forget that a little bit.
And that is, I saw that in your post about capitalism. And I think that is really important because when you see yourself as a consumer, you also understand that it is very difficult to make the change because you consume, right? So
Yeah.
you want to change the world, but at the same time you are consuming and you need to consume because you need to live at the moment in the situation that you're at. And it is very difficult to not consume at the moment, but you can be a citizen at all times and do the things that you just mentioned before.
Yeah, and the amount of effort that you could apply to being the perfect consumer, like eliminating all plastic from your life and, not driving. So now you're walking and biking everywhere or taking public transport if it's available to you. Like all of these things are very time consuming and very worthwhile doing. I'm not saying don't do them, but I am saying there is probably going to be a trade-off between what you're capable of and what means that you start to. So I guess there's like, if you look at a break-even curve or whatever it might be, there's a point where you're going to spend too much effort trying to be the perfect consumer, which could have been invested. Here we go. Here's a term to be a better citizen for a greater outcome. So in Australia, a couple of years ago, they banned plastic shopping bags from our two largest supermarkets, and they were literally responsible for hundreds of millions of plastic bags every year. So as you could have had a choice back then. Do I just stop using plastic bags, or do I start to push the government and these two corporations to stop issuing the plastic bags? And I know which one would have had the bigger trade-off. It's like stopping at the source. Stop those plastic bags from going anywhere. And now no one in Australia is using these disposable plastic bags. Everyone takes their own all of the time. But if someone had been focused on just their own use of plastic bags, they would have missed such an opportunity to create a huge change. So I like to think, don't get stuck in the individual consumer footprint. Like, do what you can. I'm not saying don't do it, but recognize the trade-off of trying to do it perfectly versus what you could be doing with your time otherwise.
That's a smart point because I sometimes struggle, not sometimes, I often struggle with this too because I'm looking for the best ways to do things to consume or even not consume as much as possible. Don't buy new stuff, but it takes a lot of time to do this. It takes time to investigate more. It takes time to get the stuff and maybe make changes. And I haven't, and I was thinking when you was talking, I was thinking about the story of two girls who would doing the same thing with these plastic bags and banning them from Indonesia and making a difference there. Instead of just, like you just said, instead of thinking about, so I don't want to do a shopping bag, and I will talk to some people about this. But what they did is, in the end, they were just two young ladies being able to change the policy in Indonesia and to ban the shopping bags there. So I think if you listen to the stories like that, you can see that it is possible for anybody to do this, right?
Yeah, I think so. And like it's so inspiring when you start to see success stories like that, to know that we can have a difference. And for at the time in Australia, like there's a very negative connotation with plastic, and there was a big TV show all about plastic that was quite popular. So it was very topical. And these corporations knew that they were facing backlash by continuing to issue these out. So it's a social tipping point, is what happened in that instance. And it was not worth the bad branding for them to continue on with it. And so that's where I think that we should be directing our efforts. There's, just for anyone listening, there's a great YouTube 12-minute video documentary based on an essay called Forget Shorter Showers. And I watched it about 5 or 6 years ago, and I still think about it all the time, because the whole message behind the video is, why would we ever think individual actions are enough to change a system that's sort of eating up our planet? And it was just really, like, at the time I was like, oh, you're right. Like, it doesn't matter what I do, it matters what the entire system does. And it's hard to change a big system. We might not win, but that's where we should be trying to exert pressure, I think.
So when you just will you send me the link of the video so I can post it in
Yeah.
the show notes so people can click the link and just watch it, because I think it makes it easy for them to do this.
Yeah.
Your course, you do this now since the beginning of this year, 2023. And who are the people joining the course? What are they doing? What is their job and what are they doing?
Yeah, so it's people who are passionate about the ecological crisis we find ourselves in and wanting to know what they can do. So typically they're not always sustainability based, but we have had lots of people who either work in sustainability, want to work in sustainability, or often new parents who, there's something about having a child that makes you go, oh, yep, this is not good. We need to be doing more. Some students, like a big cross section. We've had something like people from 16 different countries go through the course. So, a big cross section of people in the first 4 courses that we've run. ESG professionals, even people who work just in sort of top 100 companies who are very growth and profit orientated, but deep down the person taking the course knows that it's not really where they want to be. They've sort of read the degrowth literature and understand that that is not going to help their children, that sort of line of work. And so there's, what else can I be doing? Where else can I exert some pressure? And just wanting to understand, the full breadth of changes that we need to be making.
Yeah, and the tagline is reconnecting business leader with back to earth.
Yeah.
So, and you're directing it to business leaders. So I think that's really interesting, because so these people are still working in the environment where growth is really important, probably in general, and you say connecting them back to earth so that you understand the importance of what we do for the environment, for ecological, for biodiversity. So all these things is back to earth, and you do this with your partner, who has a history of he's been really studying the indigenous people and places in the world. So that's interesting. For people who are not completely aware, tell a bit more about degrowth. Why is it important, and why is it so different than capitalism?
Yeah. So if I may, I'll give my definitions of degrowth. I always tend to give 2. So the first one is a planned and democratic reduction of material and energy throughput in over-consuming nations while improving well-being in those nations and global justice. So it's a pretty mouthy definition, but it's just acknowledging that we're not leaving it to the markets. We're going to plan what we want to continue to grow. So there's some sectors that will continue to grow, such as renewable energy and insulation for homes, and electric vehicles will continue to grow, those sorts of things. But there's going to be sectors of the economy that we don't want to grow anymore. And we're not just going to leave to GDP and this aggregate continuous growth for ever and ever, just because we don't want the economy not to grow anymore. So that's the planned section. The democratic section is it has to be democratic. Like, we can't just enforce on a population of a nation what's going to happen. And so the best way to do that, probably at this stage, the consensus is through citizens' assemblies, getting everyday people, informing them of the situation, and then getting them to put forward proposals for how we reduce material and energy throughput. Over consuming. So, just when we're not asking every nation in the world to reduce their energy and material throughput, it's just those countries who are living as if they have 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 planet Earths. Because that there's a moral issue with doing that, right? Like, we cannot leave. We're racking up an ecological debt, and we're leaving it to future generations. While improving well-being in those nations. So because the economy now is structured around profit and growth, most people will be surprised to hear this, but GDP and well-being have been decoupled for many decades. So all of this growth that we're producing in the economy is not increasing well-being, and we see that sort of globally. Well-being has stagnated since about the 80s. So we can move to improve well-being by focusing on policies that look after people. We just haven't been really focusing on improving well-being because we've been so focused on growth and global justice. So it's a massive topic. And once you start diving into it, it's just difficult. For anyone wanting to learn more, I would recommend Jason Hickel's book, The Divide. But the way the global economic system is set up, it's just unjust at the moment. We're taking resources and labor from the global south, and we're using it to drive growth in the global north. And something like 85% of the world's population live on less than $30 a day, which is the poverty line in a wealthy country. That's a huge chunk, something like 5.8 million people or something. So there's more we can be doing from that point of view.
Yeah, and then you take the $30 because the UN uses the $5.
Yeah. And and it's that $5 has been adjusted for purchasing price parity, I think is the 3 Ps. So it's what $5 can buy you in the US with $5. It's a coffee. How are they supposed to live on that much money? And that's their shelter, that's their healthcare, that's their food, that's anything, their clothing. It's just a crazy figure. And we wouldn't stand for it if it was us. So that's my first definition. It's sort of very clearly just that degrowth is focused on wealthy nations, over-consuming nations, I prefer to call them. And the second definition is a quote by a guy called Serge Latouche, who's a Frenchman who came up with the term degrowth back in the early 2000s. And he calls it a decolonization of the imaginary and an implementation of other possible worlds. And I like that. I think that applies everywhere. So it's about not using growth to meet our needs anymore. It's about just meeting our needs. If someone needs a house, give them a house. If someone needs food, give them food. If someone needs shelter, give them shelter. Don't make it a product of whether the economy is growing or not. And I think that if we start to do that, we can meet people's needs in less environmentally harmful ways moving forward.
And I understand, and at the same time, I can also imagine for people it's very difficult to imagine because capitalism, the way that the system works today, is so everywhere. It's in every system. It's in school. It's in work. It's in the government. It's everywhere. It's. I think it's very difficult to imagine how you could live in a world which is stable and is not focused or fixated on growth. Um, you even have a bank account and you expect interest, right? For example.
Yeah. 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 And it will take a massive mindset shift. And actually, that's why in the Rebiz course, we spend a good couple of weeks just talking about worldview. And we know that the greatest lever for systemic change is if you can change the way people see the world. And so we spend a bit of time there. But yeah, I know we've all grown up thinking that we can expect a return on our investment and that sort of thing. I did listen to Tim Jackson on a podcast one time, and I can send the link through for the podcast. But in it, he explains how investment used to mean putting away money today for a better future tomorrow. And that doesn't necessarily mean more money, but now it does. So now we put money away today for more money tomorrow, even if it means at the expense of the future. So there will be some needing to readjust what we think is a good return on our investment. What if a good return on our investment was a habitable planet for our children? What if it means avoiding a mass extinction event? It seems like a good way to spend money for me. But yeah, there are some big systems that need to be changed, like the fund managers and the big corporate, the big shareholders of the bigger stocks and things. They are running the world at the moment, but it doesn't need to be that way. We can change government and we can implement regulations and make changes. There's a quote by Roger Hallam, who is the leader, or he sort of was the founder of Extinction Rebellion and Just Stop Oil. And he says, the quickest way to end capitalism is to continue with capitalism. It's going to end itself. You can't grow forever on a finite planet. So either we recognize that and we do something about it, or we face collapse.
Yeah, and I'd rather do the first one,
Yeah.
and not just for me, but also for the next generations too.
I know, me too.
And so the idea of putting money away for the future and also wanting to have more money in the future is, of course, that in our minds, money devaluates because if you put away $10 now, if you go like in 25 years, maybe 30 years when you retire, it will be worth like $5 maybe. I'm not sure what the exact number is, but it will be a lot less than it is worth now. How do you trick people to come to a better idea that $10 stays $10 in the future?
I think it's a little bit to do with what we've been told about our monetary systems as well. So it's probably the same where you are, but I know here we have what's called superannuation. It might be called a pension fund where you are, and it's where we're supposed to put money away into what ends up ultimately being shares and stocks so that it can accumulate in value until the time by which we retire, and then we live off that retirement plan, hopefully forever until we die. And we're really literally putting our ability to eat and stay warm in our retirement into the hands of the growth economy. Like we're all become dependent on this growth economy that we've just decided is a good idea. But it becomes really interesting when you start to learn more about modern monetary theory. Have you come across modern
I
monetary
read the
theory?
post. So maybe explain a
Yes.
little bit about it.
Yeah, Stephanie Kelton's written a book called The Deficit Myth for anyone who's wanting to learn more about modern monetary theory. But essentially, we've been given this sort of myth that governments are like households and they need to tax or borrow to spend. But they're not. If you're in a currency issuing nation, as I am in Australia, as the US is, as Britain is, and the European Union would have to have special rules, but ultimately they issue the currency there too, but not individually at the country level. There is no limit on the amount of money that can be produced. And I'm not saying that we just create money and push it out there, and we don't worry about the inflation. Inflation is sort of the point, the inflection point where we do need to keep controls in place so that we're not generating inflation. But it's not, the access to money is not the problem for a currency issuing nation, it's inflation. So this idea that we need people to invest in the stock market so they can eat and stay warm in their retirement is crazy and just making us more dependent on the growth economy than we need to be, because currency issuing nations can provide pensioners with a livable pension. Like there's no financial constraints against doing that. What is a constraint is our real resources and making sure that we have the resources in the economy to provide the food that the pensioners will need to eat, and to, you know, keep the houses up to date and whatever else that we need to do in an economy to make sure that we're all healthy and fit and able to access what we need. But money is not is not a constraint. So when you start to understand that side of things, along with the degrowth policies, it becomes a really complementary pair.
And I like the idea already in your post, and at the same time, I think so. What I'm seeing here in the Netherlands, for example, but I guess it's in a lot of countries in Europe, is that the government will just reduce the amount of money people will get when they go retire from the government, so that it becomes more and more important as an individual, as citizens, that you take care of the extra money you need to have, like together with the pension you get from the state, to with your own pension that you've provided for when you were still working. So that's going to be a huge change for the government to think about, that they will spend more money to make sure that everybody who has like a pension, or people who are sick, or people who are have disabilities, to give them enough money so that they can still live without worrying about money, because worrying about money just causes so many, difficulties in the end.
Yeah, it's huge. It's a huge component of degrowth. So degrowth, step one of degrowth is decoupling well-being from GDP. And as I said earlier, GDP and well-being have been decoupled for a long time. But at the moment, if someone was to say the economy is about to go into recession, like, it means hardship for a lot of people. It means joblessness and, not being able to pay the bills, and businesses foreclosing and those sorts of things. So we need to break that link between economic growth and, the well-being of people in the economy. So step one is to provide people with universal public services. So we're talking healthcare, high quality public transport, high quality education, secondary and tertiary. We can provide people with quotas of water and electricity and internet. Like, we can do all of these things. We can have more community gardens. We could have, there's no limit to what we can think of here. We can use our imagination. Maybe we provide people with, I don't know, coupons for the supermarkets, whatever it might be, but so that people aren't relying on the growth economy to meet their basic needs. And some of these concepts would be really unheard of in the US, where healthcare is closely tied to your employment. But we need to de-link these things. And once we do that, the second step would be to provide a publicly funded jobs guarantee, so that people can find work in the public sector and not just in the private sector. And that basically this means that it takes involuntary unemployment to zero. So if you want work, the government is the employer of last resort, and we can provide you with a job. The job, most of the literature on jobs guarantee would say that the job is determined at the community level based on what's needed in the community. That might be things like teaching children how to swim, maintaining a community garden, looking after children, some of these things. So all of these things can be done. There is no reason why a currency issuing nation couldn't provide these things. We just need people to be aware that it's possible. But I guess the challenge is also that the media in many countries is owned by the very people who benefit from the status quo, and actually, very carefully choosing the narratives that people then vote on. So that's a challenge. And it's a challenge to the social tipping point as well. trying to make people aware of these things. And there's no one out there, even in Australia, there is a Greens Party in Australia who would do many of these things. But even our Labor Party is very neoliberal in its policies, very much about the debts and not making sure it doesn't give people on unemployment too many benefits, because we need them back in private sector employment and those sorts of things. Like, it's, the narrative is very, most of the major parties, I find, are moving more right rather than more left. Yeah.
Yeah, the same as here in the Netherlands. We see the same issues. At least I see the same issues. They are moving more to the right. When we talk about liberals, they are more like talk about economy instead of just rights of people and of well-being. Which, if you were really liberal, it was all about well-being, right? Um, they talk about reduction of what you just said, the deficit of the country, instead of providing for the people who are in trouble. We have
Yeah.
we have a couple of interesting, and that's putting it mild, interesting cases in the Netherlands where the government failed, and they still fail of supplying the people who were heavily mistreated, because of, for example, drilling for gas in the upper provinces in our country caused a lot of houses to weaken because there was like earthquakes and ground that was just lowering, and so the buildings were just getting, torn, and this means that their houses are almost unlivable, and they are not getting paid like a you call this money to buy a new house, or
Compensation.
yeah, compensate, or
Yeah.
rebuild the house, or do something
Yeah.
about it, because this is costing the state the money, or Shell, who was responsible for drilling the gas at some point,
Yeah.
and things like that. So it's unbelievable to imagine in a world where the government will think of the ideas you just said, and you've written about, and you've mentioned the books, that there is plenty of money, and how we could do this.
Yeah, so there's a great quote. I think it's a Stephanie Kelton quote, and she says, "Currency issuing nations are like scorers in a baseball game. Like, there is no limit to the amount of points a baseball scorer can award, and there's no limit to money that governments can create. Like, it's literally created with a keystroke." And I think lots of people became more aware of it through the COVID pandemic, where certainly in Australia, and I know in the US and the UK, I'm not particularly familiar with what happened in the Netherlands, but they became very able to fund things very quickly when we were asking businesses to shut down because of the pandemic. And we see it a lot when it comes to the military spend. There's never a question of how will we fund it. We're just always amazingly capable of funding it. So I think we can learn, like it's very visible. It's clear to see that we can do it, but we're not leveraging it in the way that it's going to help people. It's currently being leveraged in a way to support. Well, every time the US saves a bank, there was a great quote: if the climate was a bank, you would have saved it by now. Like, they can find the money when it comes to big corporations. And, God forbid, some big shareholders might lose some money. They'll find the money for that, but they're not finding the money where it's really possible, like where it's really needed at the moment. And when it comes to the deficit, and when you hear people say, "But what about the debt we're leaving our children?" It's like, we're worrying about all the wrong things. Like, it's not real. We can pay that debt off whenever we wanted to. Whenever we decide to pay it off, we could. But the debt we're leaving our children is the amount of greenhouse gases we're putting into the atmosphere. And that is real. And we're not paying anywhere near enough attention to that. So yeah, I think the focus is in all of the wrong things.
Erin, I gotta say, I've never had somebody on the show so far who talked about this idea of printing just money just to make sure that we do all the basic things that we need to do to take care of the well-being of the people within a country or a state. And so this is a topic I definitely want to investigate more and look into and talk more about with more people about this, so that I have more episodes on this topic. So that's
I'll share a link as well. So there's a link. Jason Hickel wrote an article on degrowth and modern monetary theory, how the two relate to each other. So we can put it in the show notes for anyone who wants to look at it. And I need to be clear, I'm not saying that there isn't a limit to how much we can spend, but the limit is on whether a country's resources are in full use or not. If they're not fully employed, we can keep spending to make sure that people are employed, that they're restoring ecosystems, that they're insulating homes, that they're, building out solar and wind, all of those things. But yeah, it's
No,
a
no,
it's a really interesting topic.
and I agree, because the thing is, right now, if you look in the Netherlands, for example, there's a lot of houses who are not still using solar or the right energy, because they are just in the lower income
Yeah,
people, right? And the um, buildings or homes they are living in are just owned by other companies, and they don't want to invest this money into this, and the people themselves don't have the money to put this on. Actually, if they want to invest and want to put solar on the roof, probably they're not allowed because of the construction of the home and stuff like that. So it's
yeah.
really interesting thoughts you're just posting here to me to understand how we could change this. And
How we
I
could mobilize would be amazing,
yes,
wouldn't it?
yes.
Yeah,
And there's a lot of talk going on about that there is not enough, people have to work more, right? There's discussion that women should work more, so that we have enough employment in the market, that because companies have a shortage of people who want to work. But when I look at that, what you just explained, that's just the opposite of what we need. We need the same people, but working on different sides of the
yeah,
things they need to do.
yeah. And a big part of one of the degrowth policies that people would love is the idea that we're going to, so genuinely, honestly, if we're going to shrink back to using one planet's worth of resources and allowing people in under consuming nations to consume more, that means we've got a lot of work to do in the countries and where we live. We're going to have to shut down a lot of activity. And that does, at this point in time, mean job losses for people. So the solution under a degrowth economy for that is to shorten the working week so that the jobs that do remain get shared around. So we're talking 3 or 4 day work weeks. And like, that sounds cool, right? I don't know why we're still working 5 days a week and have 2 day weekends. So, my son would be well up for that. He thinks it's a ripoff that he has to go to school 5 days a week. Um, so, there's all of these things that we're not talking about that we could be doing for the climate. And just because I love referring to articles, can I, in the show notes, give an article? It's by David Graeber, and it's a great article. It says, if we want to save the world, we have to stop working. And it's just talking about how the work we do is actually really harmful to the planet in lots of cases.
I didn't know about that article, because I read 2 books of him now, and he's just an amazing writer. And the things that I read, the Dawn of Everything.
Yeah.
What
Yeah, I'm a little bit of the way through that one. Yeah.
what a book! My gosh, it was.
Yeah.
I didn't expect to read that about freedom and these ideas that we have, equality, for example. That's so
Yeah.
different. And the other one was about the pirates' economy at Madagascar.
Oh yeah. I haven't read that one.
Yeah, that's interesting too. So many stories that are just, for example, there's a lot of stories in that book about the rule of women. And it's the same in the Dawn of Everything. And later
Yeah.
on, everything is like in history is just rewritten, so that it looks like the women don't have any important things to do, and everything that's really important is done by men. And it's so amazing to read these stories. Yeah, I think when you
Yeah.
when you read more of these books and in articles, it's a good start. But if you read these books but go deeper into the theory, in the history even, it opens your eyes. It really go like, oh my gosh, it's so different than what we've been told so far.
It totally changes the way you see the world, doesn't it? I think, yeah, it's been a wonderful experience for me over the last couple of years of just piling through the books, just needing to know more and understand more. Um, David Graeber has a book, and I'm guilty of not having read this, but having read about the book called Bullshit Jobs. And he's just got this theory that a lot of the work we do is just bullshit. It's just doing it to create employment so that people stay in the private sector. And it's just a really interesting way of looking at what we do. And he said, people would say that their job is bullshit as well. It's not just him from his academic perch saying that these jobs aren't useful. It's people in the job saying that they don't really know what their purpose is. And so imagine taking all of those layers out and redirecting the effort of those people into things that are helpful to either people or the planet. Like how amazing we could be if that's what we did. Yeah, those sorts of thoughts are quite exciting for me.
I want to round this up, but I have one thing that I'm still thinking about. So you mentioned, or we talked about upfront that you have 3 kids, right?
Yeah.
How do you um give them the stories for a better future?
So
What
they're
kind of
little
what kind of
still.
things do you what do you encourage them, or how do you help them?
Yeah, they're little still. My guys are 4, 7, and 9. And one of the things that motivates me is knowing that one day they'll come to understand what we're facing in the future. And I want to be able to look them in the eye and say, like, I've been trying and I am trying, because I think that'll be quite confronting for them. But I don't talk a lot about it with them at this point. We talk about things like you know uh, even driving, and we drive, like we have a car, but driving is bad for the environment, and if we can walk more, that's better. Composting our food, we do that because it's better than putting the food in the bin. Like we've just talked very generally about things. Turn the lights off because we don't need to waste energy. Yeah, they don't follow a vegan diet like I do, but they don't eat much meat. But they understand why I don't eat animals. Yeah, so it's very selective. I'm a little bit protective of what they know, actually. I actually don't think it's their responsibility. I feel like we're the adults in the room. We've been the adults in the room for several decades, and it's up to us up to us to fix it. And by the time my guys are adults, I think it's going to be too late. Honestly, I just don't think expecting them to be the hope and fix things when we've got all these tipping points ahead of us and 1.5 degrees ahead of us. My guys won't even be 18 by the time we hit 1.5 degrees. Like I just think I don't want to burden them with that.
Erin, thank you so much. I learned um, a lot of things just by reading your articles in preparation, but also the things I read. I think the most important thing that I read and learned today was about the modern monetary theory. Um,
Yeah,
your ideas about capitalism. But I also, I when I when I contacted you, I like the idea of your cores, the Rebiz cores. So the idea of reconnecting business equal back to earth, I think that's just it, it's a really complete sentence. It's a really it has a lot of angles in that you can think about, and it's really complete to me. So thank you for that, Erin.
no, you're very welcome. And thank you for having me on the show. It's been a pleasure. As you know, I could talk about these topics all day. But yeah, I think back to your point about modern monetary theory, a lot of the questions on degrowth is how do we fund it? And actually, we can fund anything we can do. So that isn't really a barrier anymore.
Good point. Thank you.
You're welcome.